Welcome to Kathryn Raaker's World. Innovation, culture, adventure, fashion and health, artists, destinations, traditions. This is Kathryn Raaker's World.
Hi, this is Kathryn Raaker of Kathryn Raaker's World. Our guest today is Guy K. Mitchell. We'll be talking about his book, which is Global Warming, The Great Deception. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Guy and all about his career. Guy Mitchell created the book Global Warming, The Great Deception, and he had one goal in mind: to disapprove every science-based claim made by climate scientists and the proponents of man-made global warming hypothesis. At a time when many are questioning the value of science in the face of potential climate change, this is quite an eye-opener. First off, Mitchell explains that the world's temperature databases depict no scientific warming of the world's atmosphere, landmass, or oceans. This is through a number of research items, including NOAA measurements of the increase in the temperature and of the landmass over the last 140 years, as well as a closer look at NOAA's satellite readings and Argo float program. He also notes how the concept of an average temperature of the Earth is merely a figment of the imagination of climate scientists, merely put together to prove a fraudulent hypothesis. The temperature of the Earth is different at every point in time and space. He explains, stating that attempting to add the temperature of various locales around the world is merely a nonsensical exercise. So what does it come down to? Money, says Mitchell. He noted that over $1 trillion has been spent across climate research worldwide, but there's little to nothing to show for it now. Mitchell now joins us to discuss global warming, the Great Deception. And my first question, first off, what inspired you at all times to write this book?
Well, that's a good question. I was at a dinner party in the mountains of North Carolina about 5 years ago. And a friend who was seated at our table was a professor at a local college. And I asked him what were the challenges in teaching the students of the day. And he responded, well, they just don't want to accept certain truths. And I said, well, what truths do you mean? And he said, well, like climate change, for example, and 97% of the world's scientists believe that man has caused global warming. And there was a pause in the conversation, and the guest seated at the table looked around at me to see how I'd respond. And he turned to me and said, surely, Guy, you believe, like 97% of the world's scientists, that man has caused global warming. And I had no ready reply because my interest had really been in theoretical physics related to Stephen Hawking's theories on black holes and the work that CERN is doing with the Large Hadron Collider on the Franco-Swiss border. So for some reason, I began to do some research on that claim, and it led to more than a 4.5-year effort and more than 4,000 man hours involved in researching and writing this book.
Well, the other question I think I have with that is, do you just feel that the facts about climate change need to be told, or did something else inspire you? And we heard what inspired you.
Yeah.
Tell me, when you started looking at everything in the situation of climate change, what was the most surprising thing that you found out in your research, and how long did it take you to research for the book?
Yeah. Well, I first began my research by researching the claim that 97% of the world's scientists believe man to cause global warming. And the result of that research was the review of a paper that was published with those claims, which turned out to be just totally in error from a factual standpoint. And then I began a trail of research looking at what the world's academic and scientific organizations, this was back in the fall of 2017, believed about global warming. And I found that there were many, like the Chinese, the Russians, even the Royal Society in England, had reservations about the conclusion man had caused global warming, and they were engaged in research looking at other possibilities. So as I began to do more and more research, I began to see how the claims of man-made global warming were deficit from a scientific standpoint. I spent about 2.5 years researching, reviewing research papers published in scientific journals and other outlets to find out what the prevailing theories were and what seemed to be the basic science that adhered to the concept of first principles of science and the scientific method to evaluate the subject.
Well, you note in your theory or your book, the cost of energy sources could be seeing an increase, correct? Though its availability will also decrease. How do you think energy companies will attempt to explain this to consumers, and are there alternatives it may try to introduce, which a lot of them have already? And, you know, with the situation that's going on now in our country, with they want to shut every kind of fuel down, especially fossil fuels, nuclear fuels. I mean, this doesn't make sense to me at all. I mean, if they had alternatives to go to that would really work and didn't cost more, then it would make sense to me.
Well, I think that's right. The place to start is when you review the science, it's clear that an added concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does not cause global warming. The thermodynamic analysis, the full scientific analysis indicates that addition of about 120 parts per million of CO2 and the concentration of the atmosphere in the last, since supposedly the industrial age, has had a de minimis effect on the heat accumulated in the biosphere of the Earth. So it's a false premise, and when it's carried to the logical conclusion to try to reduce or eliminate fossil fuels, in essence, create a war on carbon, then there are significant ramifications. The first one being that there's an effort being made to reconfigure the electric power grid by adding alternative energy sources that are not reliable. The second thing is if you try to reduce or eliminate coal-fired power plants that generate electricity, then the difficulty gets to be trying to replace that capacity and maintain the availability that Americans have come to expect. So the cost will go up. The potential for blackouts. The operator of the power grid in Michigan and 14 states that are adjacent to it recently announced that there could be a prospect of rolling blackouts this summer and this winter because the Palisades nuclear power plant is coming offline, and another coal-fired power plant is scheduled to be shuttered. So the net effect will be they won't have enough capacity to meet the demand.
Well, you could see that actually in Texas.
Correct.
Remember
Yeah.
when they almost froze to death? And because these wonderful people came into the state and said, we know better than you. we're going to do it with solar energy, and we're going to do it with, you know,
Alternative energy sources.
other alternatives.
You know,
and they almost froze to death. I mean, I know
amazing.
people that were really hurting because the turbines froze, the solar power didn't work because they had so much snow on it. I mean, they're not using their brains.
Well, a lot of people don't realize there are three electric power grids in the United States. There's the Western grid, the Eastern grid, and the Texas grid. And they're all interconnected. And the reason they're interconnected is that's designed to, if one grid or if a producer within that grid has a power outage, then power can flow from an adjacent grid if needed to supplement that outage. But the problem gets to be if you have a lack of capacity in one grid, let's say the grid that's associated with Michigan and its 14 state association, and they have a deficit in the ability to produce the power that's needed, and they try to call on the Western grid, but the Western grid is operating at or near capacity, and it can't supplement it, then you're going to have a blackout in whatever grid has a less than needed capacity to supply the demand. So it's a problem. The problem with it is that once actions are taken to reduce the production capacity in any of these grids by shuttering nuclear power plants or coal-fired power plants, it's going to take a long time to build the capacity to replace that. And wind and solar right now don't have the capacity and technology to do it. And as you point out, are vulnerable to environmental situations that occur that force them offline.
So the other thing that I want to ask is, you talk about what does it say about the future of electric cars and other similar technologies? And one of the things that I want to ask is, people think that solar, not just solar power, but electric cars are the answer. The problem is you need electric to fuel the electric cars, and if you don't have electric, and there was a TV show yesterday that I was listening to, and they said these two women went on a vacation. They spent more time stopping and trying to find the electric places where they could stop and get electric, that it took them more time than they even got to go to the beach. So here's the deal. Why aren't you really thinking about this? You know, and what happens if you get stuck somewhere and they don't have an electric situation that you can plug into? Then you're going to have to get a rental car or something else to go. Am I right or wrong?
Well, you know, I think you're right. Actually, I'm a proponent of electric cars, particularly for use in urban areas where the products of combustion of an internal combustion engine may cause problems for people with respiratory issues and so forth. So electric cars in and of themselves, I think, are fundamentally a good thing. And I think as battery technology improves, the range of an electric car will improve and the performance will. But as you point out, it's just first of all, electric car batteries have to be recharged from an electric power source.
That's right.
So it's not a question, you're not replacing, because that power's got to be generated by an electric power plant. And today, 60 or 70% of the power generated in the United States is generated by coal-fired plants. And then there's a great percentage, like maybe 20, that's hydro, and then the rest of it is nuclear or in some cases alternative energy sources. So I think there's a place for electric cars, but people need to remember that we're going to need internal combustion engines that drive ships that deliver goods, locomotives that drive trains, trucks that deliver goods, automobiles and other vehicles that are going to require greater torque and greater range of operations. So I think there's a place for all these potential sources, but I think they need to be evaluated from an engineering and economic standpoint and used in those situations where it makes the most sense to apply them.
Well, we need to take a short commercial break and we'll be right back. And please give the name of your book again and where people can go and your website.
No, thank you. It's Global Warming, The Great Deception, The Triumph of Dollars and Politics Over Science, and Why You Should Care. And it's published on Amazon.com, actually on January the 4th of this year.
All right, we'll be right back on Kathryn Raaker's World and Kathryn Raaker's radio show, Let's Just Talk. We'll be right back.
Live with a human for a while and you get to know a few things. Like, I know she's actually not a morning person. I know she does strange tricks for no treats. I know that water makes her howl like crazy. I even know how the floor stays so clean. She's quick. But the one thing I will never for the life of me know is how she gets so tiny and inside that box. Natalie, how do you get so tiny?
We are back on Kathryn Raaker's World and Kathryn Raaker's Let's Just Talk with our guest today, Guy K. Mitchell, Jr. And I want him to give us his background because really, to be honest about it, in writing this book, he had a lot of knowledge. And I want all of our listeners and our viewers to find out his background. So if you don't mind, I want you to tell us a little bit about your background because you really are an expert in this field because of all the things that you've done in your life and the companies you've worked with in your own company. So, Guy, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background?
No, I'd be glad to. I attended the University of Alabama and received a degree in a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering in 1972. And my first job out of school, I was working as a maintenance foreman and a shift foreman in a coal-fired power plant. And after that, I was employed with a public company, and I was the superintendent of a plant in a steel mill in East Chicago, Indiana. After that, I was transferred to Saudi Arabia, where I ran a construction materials business in conjunction with Saudi Aramco's construction of the gas oil separation plants. And then after that, I was with the same company. I was an executive in that Fortune 500 company. I left the company and formed Mitchell Industries in 1996. And Mitchell Industries' operating unit is the Shazo, where we design and manufacture heavy-duty industrial overhead cranes. And we design and manufacture automated equipment using robotics. And we have 25 regional offices around the country where we maintain, service, and modify overhead cranes. So I've had a lot of different business experiences. Along the way, I attended the advanced management program at Harvard Business School. And I guess that about summarizes it.
Well, you know what? I'm glad you gave us that information because now we understand why you wrote the book in a sense. Because I can't understand why somebody like you, and I'm not saying maybe this administration, but the next administration, you wouldn't be part of it because you would give them guidance. Because has there been anyone in the last 10 or 15 years that is serving in the government that really understands that there is no problem with climate change, it's kind of like funding for, research on animals and stuff like that. There's no reason why you need to do that anymore, right? So
well, that's right, and that's a major concern that I have. There's been this presumption that it's been accepted in the climate science community in certain political arenas that man has caused global warming. That's a fait accompli. And so then there's, and there are certain proponents who would suggest that any effort to try to verify that hypothesis would unnecessarily delay, which needs to be an immediate response to avoid the thermal destruction of the earth. And so as a result, politicians have engaged in this this process to try to eliminate fossil fuels under the false presumption that that's going to address global warming, which is not actually reality. And the impact on our economy from the arbitrary decision to try to prematurely eliminate fossil fuel energy in the production of electricity and the operation of internal combustion engines threatens our economic security and our national security. And it's time for politicians and other decision makers to realize that this folly needs to be reversed, because it can have long-lasting adverse effects on our economy, the standard of living of every. As you point out, you may have to choose between heat and food. The standard of living of every person, frankly, in the world, not just the United States, because the Europeans are headed down the same path.
Same thing, and this whole thing. You know, there needs to be a debate. There needs to be a debate on climate change. And
well, what I propose in my book, at the end of my book, is a way forward, being that we reinstitute the Solvay conferences, which occurred. They were funded by a Belgian industrialist by the name of Solvay, and they had several of them in the early 1900s. I covered the one in 1927, which was a debate about quantum mechanics between Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. It's kind of a fascinating subject, but the point being is we need to get people that don't have a bias to and get preeminent scientists around the world to look at this issue, employing the scientific method to dispassionately evaluate the issue and see what, if anything, needs to be done. And in my opinion, based on the facts to date, it's a non-issue. It's actually the most fraudulent hypothesis, scientific hypothesis in history.
well, you know, one of the things that I want to ask you is, why do you think so much has been spent on climate research with very little to nothing to show for it, and the lack of proper tools to do the research and funneling to other funds, which they do all the time when they're doing research, you know? And it's really sad, because we're headed for a recession. People are, I'm wondering, and this is just me wondering, when they're going to stand up and say, enough, it's enough. I mean, why should we be getting fuel from Saudi Arabia and from Venezuela and from all these strange places when we have it in the ground and all we have to do is turn it on? Why are we facing this?
You know, that's a good question, and I try to address that point in my book. The problem is that when pseudoscience is used by politicians and regulators to try to affect public policy, it begins to erode our personal freedoms. If I had told you in December of 2019, within the next 4 or 5 months, that local, state, and federal governments would shut down businesses and would dictate which businesses could operate, which couldn't, and what their hours of operation, would dictate the hours of operation of how houses of worship, would limit public assembly in outdoor spaces to 25 persons or less, would mandate you know, the wearing of masks and other personal protective equipment in certain situations, you have immediately responded to me and said that couldn't happen because all of those are an abridgment of our First Amendment rights. Well, all that was done in response to a health crisis, which was the coronavirus, and now we're beginning to learn that a lot of those actions that were taken were the result of being misinformed from a science standpoint. Well, now we have another crisis, according to President Biden and climate envoy John Kerry, and that's the climate crisis. And so global warming. So they want to institute all of these limitations on personal freedom and economic freedoms that we Americans have to choose what vehicles we operate, what fuels we use to generate electricity, the composition of the power grid. And it's just an extension of the employment of pseudoscience to control the lives of, in this case, Americans in the United States.
Well, let me ask you this question then. What if they had to live with it? We cut the power off at the White House. We cut the power off in Delaware. We cut the power off to all the senators and congressmen that believe this, and they couldn't get fuel. Then what?
Well, you know, part of the logical extension of this war on carbon by politicians is that you're going to have the situation that I described previously with respect to Michigan and the 14 states that comprise its sort of a sub-operating grid, if you would. So the thing about it is that electricity does not discriminate. It's ambivalent about who the user is, and so it could very well likely be the case that in Washington D.C., certainly in New York, and Philadelphia, and Detroit, Michigan, and places that are in operating units where they face greater demand than supply of electricity in the future, that very event may happen. They may find themselves without electricity because once you have a grid go down, you can't selectively decide. Well, now the White House probably has backup generators, and I'm sure a lot of the people that you talk about have backup sources of energy, but the average American does not. And so what happens when the power goes out? Well, you don't have heat if you have electric heat. Even if you have gas, you have to have a fan blowing it. You may not be able to cook food. The food in your freezer may spoil. There's all kinds. The food at the grocery stores is just all kinds of ramifications that could result.
So what can we do about it, Guy, that will change things? Because it's going to take a little while to untangle everything that they've done.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I propose in my book that each of us who understands that the man-made global warming hypothesis is a fraudulent hypothesis, and that the carbon atom is not our enemy, but our friend, and has been for millennia, contact our politicians at the local, state, and federal level and insist that we abandon this foolish effort to try to limit the use of fossil fuels. It's not supported by science, it's not supported by logic, and it certainly is adverse to our economic interests.
Well, I want to thank you again for joining me, and love to have you back on. And this program will be all over all my networks and radio and television. And I want to thank you so much for joining me and giving me the time to have you as a guest. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, and we'll see you next time on Kathryn Raaker's Let's Just Talk and Kathryn Raaker's World.